give it another 20 seconds and see if those numbers go up, and then we'll start. All right, we'll go ahead and start. Hello and good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Client Enrichment Series presentation titled Leasing 101. My name is James Fotopoulos, and I'm a Regional Account Manager out of Region 6 in Kansas City. Before we begin, I want to let everyone know that we are recording today's session. We will provide archived Client Enrichment Series videos on our YouTube channel where you can access more than 30 past sessions any day or night. There is a link to our YouTube channel at the end of today's slide deck. We would also like to make you aware of the available GSA resources to assist you and your organization navigating through the current pandemic environment and safe return to physical workplaces. At the end of the deck are links to GSA's COVID-19 resources page and the Return to Facilities portal website. Both of these are linked directly from our homepage at gsa.gov. Today's presentation will be led by Ken Idle and Charlie Johnson. Ken Idle is a program manager with the Office of Leasing in the Center for Program Oversight, Compliance, and Workforce Development. Ken has 13 years of 1170 contracting experience as an intern, leasing specialist, and lease contracting officer. Ken currently manages the lease acquisition training and mandatory training for all lease contracting officers to obtain their warrants, as well as 4 additional national training programs for the leasing community: Leasing Light Learnings, SME2U, Lease Video Tutorials, and Leasing Conversations. Charlie Johnson joined GSA in 2002 as a leasing specialist in Region 3. After volunteering to help with disaster relief efforts following Hurricane Katrina, Charlie transferred to Region 4 and worked in the Florida office and later the Atlanta regional office. In Region 4, Charlie was a lease contracting officer, team leader, branch chief, and lease acquisition officer. In 2016, Charlie joined the Office of Leasing and became the National Program Manager for the Disaster Leasing Program. He has written multiple chapters of the Leasing Desk Guide and led the development of multiple lease acquisition models, including Disaster Lease Model and the new Simplified Lease Acquisition Threshold, otherwise known as SLAT. I do have some housekeeping instructions. Live captioning is available for this session, and we'll paste a link in it for the chat window. You can use this link to open a separate window to view the captions for side-by-side viewing from your Zoom window. We have automatically muted your audio to help us control the sound quality of the presentation. If you're new to using Zoom, welcome. We have found that the Zoom for Government platform to be pretty intuitive and very user-friendly. You can customize your view with the different pods as you see fit. Speaking of, you will see there is a chat pod as well as a Q&A area for this session. Please use your chat pod for any administrative questions you have or to report any issues you are experiencing, and one of our CES team members can assist you. Please do not use the raise hand function to ask a question during today's presentation. We want to keep all that dialogue open in the Q&A pod, which is where your questions about the presentation should reside. Any questions that we are unable to get today, we'll note all those questions, and they will be answered and posted on our website at www.gsa.gov/CES. Before we start, we do have a poll question, so we'll go ahead and bring that up for you. How much experience do you have with acquiring GSA leases? A, 0 to 1 years, B, 1 to 3 years, C, 4 to 5 years, or D, more than 5 years. So we'll give you about 10 seconds to answer that. And we'll go ahead and show the results for that one. All right, looks like more than half have 0 to 1 years. So you're in the right place as far as getting that basic knowledge for our leasing, from our leasing experts here. So thanks for coming. Appreciate it. We'll go ahead and close that poll out. And with that, Charlie and Ken, take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Charlie Johnson, and I am going to go through the Leasing Basics 101 presentation for you today. As we go through our presentation, there's a couple of symbols that I want you to keep in mind, as you'll see throughout the presentation. The one on the left is our document icon. That is a key document. That is a step that involves something that we need you as the client to review, approve, or at least just be notified of. In the middle, we have our handshake icon, and this is a step that involves significant collaboration between GSA and you as the customer. The whole thing is largely collaborative, but there are certain steps that involve a significant amount of working between the two of us, and so we want to call those out. And on the left-hand side, we have the baton. The baton icon involves a handoff. That means that there is a change in the GSA personnel that you'll be working with. You won't see that one that much because we don't like to have a lot of handoffs, but they do happen in the process, and so we'll call those out with the baton. Here is an overview of our, there we go. Here's an overview of the leasing process here. We're going to start over at step 1 with requirements development. That's where we're going to get to know a little bit about what we need to do for you. Pre-solicitation, which is where we're going to look at the market. Solicitation, where we're going to put the RLP package together, and then we'll move into negotiations. At the end of negotiations, make award, and then we'll close up with post-award. All right, so let's start with requirements development. So requirements development starts one of two ways. Either you call us or we call you. So when do we call you? Well, we're going to call you when you have an expiring lease. That means that GSA has put you into lease space. You have an occupancy agreement with us. The lease is about to expire. And we're going to reach out to you and start these conversations so that we can get an understanding of what we need to do as this lease is coming up for expiration. We're going to start these discussions 36 months before expiration for our under prospectus and 60 months before expiration for our prospectus level leases. So since a lot of you indicated that you're new to GSA leasing, we do have what we call the prospectus threshold. And the prospectus threshold is essentially a dollar value that is set every fiscal year. It can adjust. And that over that prospectus level, we actually have to approach Congress and get permission to do your lease. And that takes a lot of time. So not only are these larger leases, but they have those extra steps. And that's one reason why we start so much in advance. 36 months in advance can also seem to be, a long time. However, we want to have the right conversation with you, and we want to discuss what it is that you really need, because just because you've been in space and you've been there for 10 years or 15 or even longer, we don't want to assume that's what you need going forward. A lot of times as these leases expire, it has been a decade or more, and how you work and what you really need to fulfill your mission from a facility standpoint oftentimes has changed. So we want to have the right conversation with you. We want to develop good requirements, and we want to have those requirements done in time for us to deliver that optimal solution without the lease expiration becoming a limiting factor for us. Now, the other way that this can start is you call us. So when do you call us? Well, you call us when you need something. It could be a space request that's associated with an existing lease. Perhaps you need expansion space. Perhaps you've decided that you don't need all of the space that you have now and you'd like to reduce. Or it could be that something has happened and you need brand new space. Perhaps some legislation was passed, an executive order was passed. Something has happened where you've decided that you need brand new space to the inventory. In that case, you simply reach out to your planning manager, and your planning manager will start working with you on creating the client project agreement, or CPA. The CPA has two parts. The one on the screen you see there is a snapshot of part one. Part one will show you what you have today. And what you're going to work with the planning manager on is getting through part two. And part two is going to discuss what is it that you need for tomorrow. So at this point, what we're working on are what we call the strategic requirements. And strategic requirements are very high level, and they talk about things like the square footage, your mission and operational needs, those go and no-go requirements. Those are things like I have to be on the first floor, or perhaps it's the opposite. Maybe you really can't be on the first floor. These could also be things like incompatible adjacencies. Perhaps you have a security issue. You could be a client that works with detained individuals, and so perhaps you don't want to be next to schools and churches and those types of things. On the other hand, you could certainly be on the other side of the spectrum, and you have a tremendous public interface, and so you need easy access to public transportation, and all of that kind of welcoming environment. So we deal with clients that are all over the spectrum on that, but we need to identify those go, no go requirements. And then important client milestones. Again, what is important to you? Is it just the lease is expiring? Okay, that could be. Or again, this could have some space that we're acquiring for you that's tied to an executive order, or again, legislation or something where you have a deadline that we really need to be mindful of. You have a requirement to be operational by January 1st. And so we want to make sure that we identify that right up front. So when we're talking about strategic requirements, I like to use this analogy of the box, because what we're really trying to figure out here is at a high level, what is it that we're getting for you? And we're trying to get towards that idea of, do we need a lease, or could we put you in own space? So we start with these high level concepts. How big is this box? And we could start with a square footage. Your agency may have already determined a square footage that you need if you have space standards, or it could be something that just starts with, we need space for 65 people. And then of course we can work with you, work through those utilization rates that you are there that you see, and we can help you determine how large this box is. We can also help you optimize that space. If you come to us and say, well, here we need 500 square feet per person, we would certainly want to talk to you and try to figure out how can we make this space perhaps a little bit more efficient. In the middle there, you see that pirate ship map, and that map again with the X marks the spot. Where do we need to put this box for you to be able to fulfill your mission? Your DA, your delineated area. That's very important in government acquisition, because we're going to do a government contract acquisition, and we have to have a delineated area. And that delineated area can be influenced by your mission. For example, if you are mine safety and health, you may want to be near the mines where you work and help those individuals. If you are SSA, you may want to be downtown. Or on the other hand, you may very much not want to be downtown, because perhaps you already have an SSA office downtown. So what you may want to do is be in another area where you're going to service your geography. Okay, so we're going to figure out all of those things by talking to you, making sure that we understand, again, where does this box need to be? And over here on the right, we have, again, that star. And that's, again, just sort of a catch-all of what's special about this build out. Is it, do you have something very unusual that we really need to know about from the very beginning? You could have holding cells. Those are things that we need to know about from the very beginning. Sally port requirements and such. On the other hand, it could be that this is something that has significant public interface. So you need a very large lobby, and you need easy access for the public. Those are the things that we want to know, because as we go to the next step, we're going to help to figure out how we're going to fulfill that space requirement for you. Once we get the CPA down, we're going to look at the market, and we're going to come up with what is called the occupancy agreement, or OA. Now, if you are familiar with leases or with owned space, we also use OAs in our federal buildings. So the occupancy agreement, or OA, is an agreement with GSA and you as the client. And it goes through a couple of terms. How long is the OA? How much space are we assigning to you through this OA? And most importantly, the OA covers the expected financial cost of this leasing action for you. So at this point in requirements development, we're over here at the draft OA stage. And this is what we're going to prepare for you. And it's going to have to be something that you sign and it's going to have an estimated, and this will be a very generic estimate, but an estimated cost. It could be that it's the market is on average $35 a foot, and you're asking us for 10,000 square feet. And so we'll put that into an OA so that you can see that and see this is about what I should expect. As we progress through the process today, we'll move to the award OA. The award OA is sent to you right before award. It only has to be signed if the award amount is higher than what you signed for at the draft stage. However, the award OA amount will have the actual negotiated amount. So if we sent you a draft OA that had an average of $45 a foot, hopefully we did a little bit better than that. Maybe we were able to negotiate 43. You'll get that information in that award OA. As we go through post-award build-out and we finalize all these costs and the change orders and everything is reconciled, the last OA is that final OA, and that will be sent to you just to simply say, we are now done with the space action, and this is what you're going to be billed. All right, the flow chart here shows how this process moves along in step one. So as we discussed, we determine those strategic requirements. There you see that handshake icon. We cannot figure out your requirements without working very closely with you. The next step is to determine the housing strategy. So we figured out what it is that you need. And now the next thing is we're going to say, well, do we have owned space for this? Or is this just simply going to be a lease? It could be that you've been in a lease, but as federal management regulations call for, our first preference is always to house an agency's facility request in owned space. So we'll always look at, even if you've been in a lease, how could we move your space into a federal building and make better use of those taxpayer dollars? On the other hand, of course, there certainly are some times if you're fish and wildlife, you may be nowhere close to a federal building, and the answer is rather simple. Once we get past this stage here, you see our key document icon. That's where you'll have that CPA, and the OA will be sent to you where we say, okay, we figured out what you need. We've determined that we're going to place you in a lease. Certainly for purposes of this presentation, we're assuming we're doing a lease. You're going to get those key documents now, CPA and the OA. We're going to ask you to sign those documents. That's just going to help us to make sure that we're on the same page as we move to this next step, which is to assign your request to a regional team. This is where you're going to meet your project manager. Your project manager is going to be your main point of contact all the way through the project, depending on a couple of variables, such as how large and complex your project is. That project manager may be your lease contracting officer, or it certainly could be a separate individual. But they're going to work with you on coming up with your technical requirements as we take the strategic requirements and we develop those into functional and then technical requirements that we can actually deliver. And the project manager will work with you on your project schedule. And this is something that's very important because one of the things that we get asked all the time is well, how long is this going to take? Well, that answer is very complicated because our projects can be 6 months long. They can be 5 years long. Again, we have a very broad spectrum of projects that we do within the leasing program. So the only answer is really to talk to your project manager and get that schedule created at the very beginning and make sure that you understand what we think it's going to take us to deliver this. Are we delivering you 5,000 square feet or are we delivering 500,000 square feet? Again, we'll come up with that project schedule and then hopefully we'll all have an understanding that of what we're going to deliver. So now that we've moved on to this next stage and we have a regional project team working on it, we have a couple of tools that we might bring forward to help. One is the Global Leasing Services, or GLS. In the current iteration, we call this GLS Plus. This is affectionately known as the broker contract. The broker contract is where we have standing contracts with private sector real estate brokerages, and we bring in these contractors to help us. GSA in the leasing program uses contracted help in the same way that very likely your agency has federal employees and contracted employees as well. So we use the broker contract to bring people in to help us to augment our workforce and to bring in this excellent knowledge that they have. This is certainly something that you're likely to see if you have one of those larger or more complex projects, because they bring in a wonderful amount of knowledge that we can help to use to deliver this complex space for you. Down at the bottom, we have our automated advanced acquisition program, or AAAP. Now, AAAP has been around in the DC area for a very long time and has more recently been expanding out to the rest of the country. It is now active all across the country and is very successful, especially in those major markets and those secondary markets. And it is making inroads in markets more and more every year. So as the years go on, it is more and more likely that you will use the AAAP program in order to get your space. You should note that the AAAP process is slightly different than the global process or traditional process that we're going to cover in today's presentation. And we'll note a few places in which that process is slightly different. But AAAP is an online platform where once a month we go out to the market and say, what space do you have that you would like to lease to the federal government? You take in the bids and we match it up with requirements that we might have for that particular month. It's a very quick way to get space, and if it is something that we can use to get space for you, it is likely going to be something that we use because it is so much faster than doing an individual contract procurement, which is what we're covering today with our traditional process. So now that we've determined what tools that we're going to use, we have to talk about acquisition strategy. We're going to talk, in other words, are we going to compete the lease? This is one of the most frequently asked questions from our clients. Are we going to compete this, or are we going to do this as a sole source, especially, of course, if you have an expiring lease? Well, we like full and open competition. Full and open competition is the cornerstone of our acquisition program and really the acquisition program of the federal government. The Competition and Contracting Act establishes full and open competition as the default acquisition strategy, and we use competition to lower these costs and then pass those savings on to you. So it is never wrong to compete a lease. And we have moved a lot more in recent years towards competing more leases. And sometimes even if you have an incumbent landlord, the act of competing an expiring lease can help them to be more aggressive in the rates that they offer for the new lease. Now, of course, there are exceptions. So we do have a couple of times in the leasing program where we will do a sole source acquisition. A sole source acquisition, of course, is where we do not allow the market to compete for it. We have identified for a very good reason that we are only going to negotiate with one party and move forward with them. So we have these two reasons here, and at the top is the most easiest to explain, but it is the least common, and that is our mission-based justification. When an agency's mission is so specialized for that location that we can only acquire space that is capable of meeting your requirements from one source, that's when we have a mission-based sole source. Common example of this is TSA. So TSA has space that they have to have at the airport, and the only way to lease space at the airport is to lease it from the airport authority. So in that case, we would have a mission-based sole source. Now, again, we always look at the mission for that location because in this example, TSA certainly does have leases that are not at the airport, even if they're close to the airport. And those are leases that we would start off with the idea that we're going to compete those contracts. At the bottom, we have our cost-based justifications, and those are a little bit more complicated. So we'll talk about it here and on the next slide. So when we look at an expiring lease, one of the things that we do is we look at whether or not the incumbent landlord remains a good opportunity. And we look at the cost to remain in place, and we compare that to the cost to potentially relocate you. Now, a good example of this would be an agency whose space continues to meet their ongoing needs, and perhaps you only want new carpet and paint. That would be a good example. But again, there are multiple things that we look at before we decide to use a cost-based justification. What we look at here is the seesaw approach. We have the cost to stay, and we have move and rep cost, or move and replication cost. If we move you and we replicate your space somewhere else. When we have the seesaw on the left, we are almost certainly going to compete this. Where we may not compete a lease is when we have the seesaw on the right, when the cost to stay is simply so much less than the cost to relocate your agency. And in that case, we may make a decision based on that and other variables, such as how good has this landlord been doing over the past contract period. We may make a decision to not compete that lease. I do want to point out, it's very important, that if GSA decides to compete your expiring lease contract, it does not mean that we are going to ignore your landlord's incumbent financial advantage. So we can compete a lease, and we can still consider this cost advantage when we're making the award decision. So for example, we could have a situation where through our analysis, we've determined that the cost advantage to the federal government to stay in place is $1 a foot. That is a situation where we're very likely to compete that lease, because $1 a foot's not really that much. But we certainly can take that savings into account when we're deciding who we're going to award to. All right, let's take a quick moment here, and we'll take a couple of questions before we move on with the rest of the presentation. So let's see, do we have some questions?
Yep. Charlie, I was looking at the Q&A pod, and some of these questions I think are going to be answered as we go through the presentation itself, but I'll read them off to you, and you can defer to later in the presentation if you think that makes sense.
Sure.
The first one we got was, how accurate is a cost estimate at 36 months?
Well, so that's gonna be based on how much is the market moving, and how close is your space need to the average cost of the market. So let's say your space need is in Miami, Florida. Well, that's a major market. We have a number of databases that can tell us what the space is going for in Miami, Florida, and we can certainly, again, assuming you're looking for quote unquote, vanilla office space. We can certainly give you probably a pretty good estimate. But obviously it also depends on how fast is that market moving. Most markets, move by percentages in a given year. So we certainly hope that we don't give you an estimate that somehow is off by 50%. But again, you can have markets that are going through inflationary periods where it's going up, and you can have markets where it's going the other way. Market cycles go through the expansion and contraction. So how accurate is it? It's going to be based on a couple of variables, but we do a pretty good job of giving you what is a ballpark estimate.
Thanks, Charlie. And I think some of that also probably deals with how complex are the requirements, or the breadth of requirements that we receive.
That too, and again, yeah, I mean, if it's a dog training facility for DHS, that's probably not something we have a big database for. But if it's office space, we probably do pretty well.
Thanks, Charlie. The next one is, what if a non-prospectus expiring lease becomes a prospectus future lease? And the example they gave was, say you're consolidating several expiring leases and it creates that prospectus threshold requirement. Hopefully that doesn't happen too often, but I'm not sure if you've seen that.
It certainly does. We actually use an example of that in our Leasing Project Management 101 course that we teach as well for our new project managers. And we actually use an example of that where there's, perhaps 3 leases coming together. And now, we had 3 separate leases, and the first one is expiring and triggers this process. But now as we discuss it, we find out we actually have a prospectus. How often does it happen? Not much. But it's in a lease portfolio of 8,000 plus leases. Certainly. What do you do? Well, you have to sort of re-baseline that schedule and those expectations. You have to go through the project schedule with the project manager, and you have to just reassess. And probably we're going to be looking at doing some extensions perhaps for the expiring leases, because we may need more time than we thought.
Thanks, Charlie. And in one of your slides that you have the project flow chart there, somebody noted the reflected negotiated lease terms phrase there. Is the TI included in that total?
It would actually normally at the award stage, it would not include negotiated TI, because we typically include our a TI allowance, which again, we'll talk about in the presentation. We normally do not negotiate the cost of TI until post-award. So you would not see the actual cost of the TI at the award OA. There is a process that we use for certain specialty requirements where we do what we call a turnkey lease. That's not very common at all, but if it was a turnkey lease, then we would negotiate the cost of TI before award, and then you would see the actual TI cost at the award stage. But normally what is in the award OA would just be based on your TI allowance.
All right, Charlie. Well, we've got some more questions, but I think we'll go further into the presentation, because I think some of these questions will line up a little bit better with those as we go through it. Thanks, Charlie.
Okay. All right. So let's move on into step 2. And step 2 is where we're going to start talking to the market about the requirement that we've developed with you back at step 1. All right. So pre-solicitation is all about market research, and we have a couple different ways that we do market research. So we're going to look at available properties using online databases such as CoStar. We may place an advertisement on sam.gov, or for some folks, FedBizOps was the old system, but it is now called sam.gov. And we just have old-fashioned telephone outreach. Pick up the phone and call contacts that we have in the market. Again, we always get various flyers and things, and then through CoStar you can find a lot of space and who reps that space, and pick up the phone and talk to them. So that'll help us to locate available properties and come up with a little bit more of what are those negotiation objectives. Now, after we find out what's out there, we're going to set up a market survey. This is one of the most important parts of the global leasing process, and that's where you see on this slide we have 2 of our different key icons. We have the handshake at the top. Well, this is a very collaborative step. For a lot of our more routine leases, this is probably the first time, and maybe the only time until the very end, that you and the GSA team are all together in one place and working through this stuff. So again, significant collaboration here. What is the GSA role? Well, our first role is to pre-screen our properties. So we placed an ad on sam.gov, and perhaps we got 10 responses. Well, if 3 of them don't work based on the requirements that we identified, we don't want to waste our time, your time, or really the market's time. In real estate, a lot of times people will submit properties and they might try to talk to us and say, well, I know I'm not in the delineated area, but we just did this major renovation and our property's beautiful. And in the private sector, sometimes that works, and they come and they take a look. In government acquisition, we have to stick to the rules, so to speak. So we're going to pre-screen those properties. Perhaps, again, we've agreed that you need to be on the first floor. Well, if that's something you've identified, then we don't want to show you space that is not on the first floor. We're going to lead the market survey once we set up everything. We're going to get the itinerary together. We're going to set up all that logistics. And you guys should just be able to kind of show up and hopefully have an enjoyable time going through these buildings. A lot of people like doing market surveys. And of course, we'll fill out those market survey forms, and that is the key document icon that you see there in the middle. But we both have something to do with these market survey forms, because what is your role as the client? Well, it's to have the required decision makers available. When we do these market surveys, um, you know, we want to make sure that we do this one time. We don't like to have multiple market surveys. It's not a good use of our time, your time, or the taxpayer money, especially if we have to send people out and put them on travel and per diem, and perhaps hotel and flights available are involved. So we want to have those decision makers available. That means that if your office manager needs to be a decision maker, well, then they need to be on the survey. On the other side, we don't want to have everybody that wants to go just go, because this is a government contract acquisition, and procurement integrity is very important. So as we're doing this market survey, we don't want to just talk freely about the properties that we're seeing and all of these different things. We want to keep all of that among only the people that have a true need to know, and those are those decision makers. So while it might be perfectly appropriate to have, again, say the office manager, or perhaps one person, maybe representing the staff, again, that person needs to understand their procurement integrity responsibilities. And we certainly, if you have 30 people in your office, we certainly don't want to have all 30 people go. Now, once we are on the survey, we need to review properties against the agreed upon requirements, and make sure that we're sticking to what we've agreed to. These decisions need to be as objective as possible, even though occasionally there are certain subjective aspects to it. We want to be as objective as possible. In other words, if we've said that you have to be on the first floor, again, that's a very objective thing. We should always keep in mind that properties can be renovated. In fact, we have a lot of success with renovated properties. And so just because something looks like something today doesn't mean that that's what it's going to look like later. Now, so then you'll work with the GSA team at the end of the survey. Perhaps you saw 5 buildings, and perhaps, again, 3 of them work and 2 of them don't. Hopefully we agree on that, and then we'll sign those market survey forms. That's, again, where we need those decision makers on the survey, because otherwise it starts to drag out when we don't. So those key decision makers, they sign the market survey forms, and then that allows us to move forward. All right, now we've been talking about the traditional or global model. Well, with the global model, the market survey occurs before the solicitation is issued and before bids are received. And we're going to look at all of the eligible properties. So again, through our market research, we identified, perhaps 10, maybe we pre-screened out, several of those. So we went and we looked at 6, and maybe we decided 2 of the 6 didn't work. And so we have 4 that are left. That's the typical market survey process. AAAP and our new SLAP model work a little bit differently. The market survey really occurs after bids are finalized. So what we actually do is we get the bids in, and we take a look at the building, and then we only go look at the lowest responsive offer. And this is known as a building tour. So we don't really do a market survey with the AAAP and SLAP models. We do what we call a building tour. So again, we've already got the bids in, and we've already negotiated, and we think that we know who the lowest responsive offer is. And then we're going to go look at that building and perhaps have a backup lined up in case that building somehow doesn't work out. But in this case, we've already negotiated with that building, and we've completed some amount of due diligence. So we should be fairly confident that that building is going to work for you. And hopefully we don't need that backup. But again, it's a little bit different. There are pros and cons to this process. There are times when doing a market survey is better. Again, larger, more complex needs typically will use the global model. This way it allows us and the market to kind of have an opportunity to look at each other before we go through a very long and costly for the private sector selection process. AAAP and SLAT. AAAP can still certainly do some very large leases, but we don't really use AAAP for a very specialty product. Again, we do some complex healthcare space and those types of things. But AAAP works for the vast majority of our portfolio. And the SLAT model focuses on those smaller deals. And so between the due diligence that we do and the solicitation that we put out, we're normally very confident when we go look at that building is going to work for you. All right, let's take a quick moment here and go to a couple of questions. And we'll do a few questions here, and then we'll go into the next section.
Yep, Charlie, we got some more that came in. As far as market surveys go, I know probably since we're in the pandemic, once we leave that, do you see us still using the virtual platform for market surveys, or do you think we'll start doing in-person ones again?
I certainly believe that we will return to more normal. The pandemic has sort of really accelerated a lot of innovation. And, for example, through our broker contract, we have access to some really great technology that allows us to do these 360-degree videos, sort of what perhaps you may have seen if you're looking at houses or something. You sometimes see those 3D walkthroughs, but they can actually go out and they can set up the cameras, and they do those 360-degree pictures, and that has allowed us to to do a lot of business even in the pandemic, and also very much limit who has to go out and walk through these buildings. So again, I hope that we get back to normal. I really do. But I hope that we sort of get back to a better normal where maybe we incorporate that technology, but also have some boots on the ground. Because I think, of course, we'll never do better than you being in the building and able to look.
All right, we got another question here. During the pre-solicitation market survey, does GSA have expertise to screen buildings to ensure that the property complies with all ADA and ABAS standards?
When we're doing a market survey, we do have certain checklists, but the market survey is if we were to go out and actually measure all of these things, we would be for any sizable building, we would be out there for half a day for one building. So we do have a checklist. We certainly are going to look through the buildings, and we're going to say, okay, do I see, because ABAS is our standard, not ADA. So we use ABAS, and we do have on our market survey forms items, critical items that we look at, and we'll certainly go into the bathrooms and make sure that there is an accessible stall. We'll certainly look for those ramps. Again, we're going to issue a solicitation that will have all of the necessary legal language so that landlord understands what their requirement is. And in the end, they have to certify that either their building meets that standard, or if they don't, they understand that they're going to have to bring that building up to that standard, and that would be at their cost. So we've used ABAS for a very long time, and it is very well incorporated into our standard. If we note something on the survey, again, a lack of ramps, again, a lack of that accessible bathroom stall, those are things we would certainly bring up to them and make sure they understand. So, for example, we might tell them, you understand that you don't have accessible restroom facilities right now, and that would be a requirement, at your cost if you want to proceed. And it's certainly in my career, I think, maybe one time, yes, I did run into somebody that simply wasn't willing to do it. But these days, even more so, all these years later, I think most people are, they're ABAS compliant, and it's not normally a limiting issue for us.
All right, Charlie. Well, we do have questions, but I think I'm gonna wait till the next pit stop here in the presentation, and we'll continue on.
All right, well, let's go on to the solicitation, which is step 3. And this is where we're going to get the very important RLP package. Now, RLP stands for Request for Lease Proposal. So we're going to get that package out. And there's 2 major parts or 2 key documents here of the solicitation package. So we have the RLP, which is the Request for Lease Proposals, or the solicitation. The RLP describes the space that we're asking the market for, as well as describing how we're going to conduct this requirement or this solicitation and pick the winner. And on the left-hand side, we have the lease. Well, what is the lease? Well, the lease is the contract. That's what they're actually bidding on. The lease is a fairly lengthy document, and it sets forth the duties of the landlord and the government, because we certainly do have some obligations ourselves throughout the term of the lease. Now, there are more parts to the solicitation package, the fine print, so to speak, but these are the 2 major ones. Now, as we go through this, it's important to kind of understand a little bit of the difference between these 2. We like to use, again, this rocket analogy. The RLP is that booster rocket that is helping to lift us into the sky. As we get into the sky and we get far enough up, we make a ward, and at a ward, those booster rockets, they fall back down to the Earth, and they detach from the lease, which is that space shuttle there. So I wonder, as we go forward with SpaceX and all these other more advanced technologies, we might have to get a new picture, but hopefully folks still remember the good old space shuttle. Again, as you look through these things, it's important that you understand the different purposes, because we need you as the client to help us as we come to this next step, where we see our handshake icon. So the handshake here, it shows that this is the package we're about to put on the street, out for bid. So we have the RLP package and the lease. It is very important that you take a look at it. You don't have to read the whole thing cover to cover, but we certainly want you to look at some important items, a couple of which we have here. Validate that your square footage range is important. This is perhaps maybe the most important thing. Back at the CPA, we decided that you need 10,000 square feet. Well, we put out our RLPs typically with about a 5% range. And that's just because, in the realities of the market, nobody has 10,000 square feet. They might have 10,120 square feet, or they might have 9,980 square feet. But we want to make sure that range works for you. So again, 10,000 could be your minimum, and we need to go up. 10,000 could be your maximum, and so we might be going 10,000 and then go down by 5%. So we also want to talk about post-award design development. That will be in the lease, and again, we want to make sure that that post-award design development timeframe works for you. This is something hopefully that we also discussed way back with your project manager when we were coming up with the project schedule. So it's hopefully we're just validating what we've already agreed upon. We may have agreed that you need 3 weeks to review construction drawings. If that's the case, if you see a lease package that's sent to you and it says 2 weeks, then we want to call that out to our attention so that we can go in and say, oh yes, we agreed on 3 weeks, and let me make that correction so that the contract and our project schedule are in alignment. Special requirements, certainly those, those go, no-go requirements, all of those things, we want to make sure that we've captured those. You have to be on the first floor. You can't be on the first floor. Again, if you have very specialty build out, we'd like to have that in the package. We certainly don't want to put out something that for example, you might need a sally port, and you might have 3 holding cells. We certainly don't want to put a space request out on the street that is somehow just silent on those things. Again, we want to be very clear and transparent with the market. So somebody bids on this, again, perhaps it's reps change with the buildings or something like that. So even if we talked about something on the market survey or in the ad, Again, this is where it's very important that we're very transparent with the market. So we want to put those things in there as part of your special requirements. And most agencies that have those types of requirements have a standard special requirement package that will include with your RLP. All right, so we're coming a little bit to the end of my section here, but how are we going to get this out on the street? Well, we're going to there's two different methods. If it's AAAP, then they're going to go to our lease offer platform. The future of leasing is online. That's a phrase that we're using more and more now. We have the lease offer platform. The lease offer platform is where we have AAAP that we've been talking about. We also have the other side, which is our requirement specific acquisition platform, or RSAP. And that's what we would use, our SAP, with the global model to get bids online, because we really are trying to move away from paper now. And whether we're using AAAP or we're using the global or SLAT models, we really want to get our deals done online, get our bids online. So if it's AAAP that we're using, they're going to download the RLP, the request for lease proposal, from our lease offer platform. And if we're using the global or SLAT model, then we're going to post the RLP to sam.gov. So again, we advertise on sam.gov. We also are going to be putting the RLPs out on sam.gov, and that's in addition to emailing it or anything else that we may do just to get it out there. There certainly are places in the world, in America, where we still sometimes have to literally just mail them, in hard copy, and so again, we're trying to move more towards these online methodologies, but we do whatever the market requires. So, all right, so that is the end of my section, and I am going to turn this over to Dr. Ken Idle, and he is going to take us through step 4, and we're going to make an award, and then he'll take us through post-award as well. And I'm going to transfer control to you.
All right, are you seeing clearly?
Yes, we are.
Okay, cool. All right, so thank you, Charlie, for taking us up to the negotiation phase. And now that the RLP has hit the street, there are a couple important things to note. The first is that you may not hear from your leasing specialist or project manager much during this time. GSA does have a rather large lease package, and every year that template goes through changes and edits to help address issues we find in our process. So, our leases can be, well over 30 pages, and we need to get give the private sector a chance to fully digest that contract and get it in front of them. So, our internal guidance found in GSAM on this gives a minimum of 20 calendar days for the offeror to consider that package. There is some cutout exceptions there if we have a SLAT deal or one with unusual and compelling urgency, a disaster lease procurement. Those can be faster. But at this point, the leasing specialist is likely sorting through the good and bad data back from the building reps. They're also trying to maintain procurement integrity and not share proprietary price information from the offerors. There's also probably some training going on, teaching these new offerors to the government, how to use our forms and systems, as well as the definitions in the contract. So also noteworthy that, prices are dynamic throughout that 20-day period. So, other than giving, you an idea of sufficient interest and a possible deal, any pricing information during that time will be subject to change and up until the point where best and final offer is signed. So, specific pricing info just isn't quite valuable yet, but perhaps good questions to ask a week or so after that RLP issuance to your specialist would be, are you getting good offers back, just to help the team gauge if this will be a successful round. So what is going on behind that negotiation curtain? Well, like I mentioned before, mostly helping offers understand the deal, helping them get comfortable with the terms and conditions, working out their pricing elements. And, depending on the deal, there can be some selling involved from our side. Not everyone is comfortable with a federal government tenant. So, we do our best on our side to, accentuate the positives of our tenancy, which are, longish firm terms, our AAA credit rating. And keep in mind, we're bringing this contract to them. So it's like a 30+ page contract. That's not normal for them, So they see all these paragraphs and they may even want to change them. But most of our deals are done via LPTA, which is lowest price technically acceptable. And we can't tell an offeror what to do, but we do advise them that changing any language in the deal, very well could affect the technical acceptability of the LPTA, which would make their offer technically unacceptable. They could have the lowest price, but they could get eliminated if they break out the red pen a little too often on our lease template. So we're doing our best to keep the template intact and to compare and evaluate apples to apples deals. The GSA lease is not equal to the market standard for commercial real estate pricing. That's especially important to know in this phase of the procurement. So let's go over each of these major price components that are listed on this slide. So we have the shell, the building shell. That's the box that Charlie described. The GSA shell is defined in the lease over many pages, and we can think of it as a summary of the warm lit area that will have our office. And we'll show a picture and describe that a little bit later in the presentation. The operating cost, that's the utilities for that box. We offer a form, GSA form 1217, that helps offerors understand how to apply those op cost components and help with pro rata calculations based on our size and the total building size. And then finally, a major cost component is the tenant improvements, or the TIs. This is the pricing component that makes the general box into your agency specific box, with the building improvements coordinated, and I use that word on purpose, coordinated, and we'll talk about that later, with the GSA defined shell. So how does a leasing specialist determine what's a fair deal? Well, we use those negotiation objectives that Charlie talked about earlier. So the negotiation objectives is a document that leasing specialist creates, and it defines our predetermined price targets before we head out to the market. It's kind of like the bullseye that you send down range before you start shooting. The negotiations can be a little art and a little science. It can also be very easy if you have experience with that market, and it can be a bit more difficult and a bit longer process if you don't. But generally, the more data points you look at, the better your range targets will be. The sources, and I know Charlie mentioned this earlier, that we use most are listed on this slide. You get market survey info, CoStar, LoopNet, and even internal GSA data from projects in that market in the recent past. So basically anything you can get your hands on to help you get a picture for what prices are doing in that delineated area. So we do offer tools that help speed up procurements and eliminate some of the more time-consuming back and forth clarifications with offerors. So like, for example, some of the things that we see are math errors on documents, handwriting issues, misplaced figures, stuff like that. And so two very successful tools we've found to help with that are on our lease offer platform. So, the LOP. LOP is essentially our, electronic submissions gateway, and it gives offerors the ability to submit offers with our AAAP or our RSAP submission process. And we're not going to dig too far into the actual inputs of the AAAP and RSAP via the lease offer platform, but I just want you guys to know that we're always evaluating ways, from requirements development on, to shorten the procurement time and to get you into your office as efficiently as we can. And we found LOP to be a key to help with that goal. All right, so earlier we did a poll to find out how much experience the group has with GSA deals, and we had a pretty good mix of backgrounds. And I know Charlie talked about this a little bit, but many of you who have been around a while may remember, when you've always done the market survey tours before offers are received. Well, that's still a standard part of the global traditional RLP process, but it's important to note that not all processes flow that way anymore. So, like I mentioned in the last slide, we're heavily focusing on getting you into space as efficiently as possible. And with some of our other models like AAAP and SLAT, the tour is after offers are received to save time and effort for both us and the private sector. There's always going to be a time, or there's always going to need to be a time where we walk through the building before it's contracted to make sure it meets the requirements. But when that happens now depends on that procurement model. Another part of the procurement process that can change timing depending on the model is the due diligence checks. Like the market survey always will occur, but in efforts to make things as streamlined as possible, it may now happen after the apparent lowest offer is identified. And in that due diligence phase, we look for items that are listed on the slide, like fire life safety, verification of space size via drawings, seismic certifications. One note on the due diligence that ties back to Charlie's portion of the RLP, we need to make sure that all items are able to meet the RLP. And this is a really important note to emphasize. So, if we have language in the RLP about walkable distances to public transportation or food places or stuff like that, those need to be checked. If those aren't checked, they can lead to bid protests. So, please work closely with your leasing specialist to make sure everything in that RLP package are things that you really need in there. So, otherwise good locations could be knocked out because they're not close enough to a Taco Bell or Wendy's or a bus stop. And, those might be things you might not even care about. So once all those boxes are checked and offers are in, before the deadline for final proposal revisions, we do a final evaluation via the method described in that RLP, a present value analysis. And the offer that has the lowest price is technically acceptable and fits within negotiation objectives to be a fair and reasonable determination, they win. All right, so what happens next? Well, there's 2 tracks of work and approval in the award process. So the first track, some of you may have already seen this, is the recommendation letter to the agency. So we'll include the building info, key terms of the deal, and may have a revised OA attached to, depending if the rates were higher than the original draft OA. That second draft is the final leases being created. So it has all the placeholder language changed into the apparent successful offeror's info, lessor's name, address, signature line updates, and it's effectively changing that person from offeror to lessor once that lease is executed. And then now we have a poll.
We'll go ahead and launch that poll. All right. Have you ever used AAAP? A, yes. B, no. You have a 50-50 chance of being right. I'm just kidding. There's no wrong answer. All right, we'll go ahead and get the results.
All right, so 85% no. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So some of this AAAP stuff might be pretty new to the folks on the line today, it seems like. Cool.
All right, we close that out, and you know what? This is good timing for questions. We do have a lot of questions about AAAP, so we'll run through those. As far as the model with the lowest, does the AAA model with the lowest responsible offer pre-identified by GSA appear to the tenant agency as lack of choice, where GSA essentially directs the agency to locate a specific building at a specific address? How can a tenancy exercise some discretionary choice when the AAA model is applied?
Yeah, so Charlie, I don't know if you want to jump into this one, but typically when we do the AAAP method, we're looking for general space, right? If you have specialized space, it's probably not the method for you. So if there's a lot of requirements or special requirements, you probably aren't going down that AAAP road to begin with. And Charlie, I don't know if you want to add to that at all.
Well, ultimately, I think we have to, go through this in a way that, there is no way for the government, whether it's GSA or the agency, regardless of model, to sort of, just pick where we want to go. What we have to do is identify requirements, and we put a solicitation out to the market, and then we have to go through, a structured acquisition process. So in theory, if we had a bidding pool of 5 people and we used the global model, we would do a market survey of those 5, and let's say, building A is acceptable and meets the requirements, they would go in the bidding pool, and then building A would be the lowest offeror, and they would be selected. With AAAP, if we had a bidding pool of 5 people in that area, it would be the same thing. If building A was acceptable to your requirements and was the lowest offer, then they would be the one that would be selected. The difference is with AAAP or the SLAT model, that's the only building that you would look at. But either way, that's the building that would win. Agencies always have an ability, whether it's a market survey or if it's the AAAP and SLAT building tour, you're always going to be evaluating the building against your bona fide requirements. And if we somehow made a mistake, and we've showed you building A, and building A legitimately does not meet your requirements, then we would knock that building out, whether it was the global process with a market survey, or if it was the building tour process. So either way, in theory, you would arrive at the same answer. It's just a different way of getting there.
And someone asked a follow-on question on that same thread there. If you had agencies, or not agencies, you had lessors that had around the same price offered, what would you do then? Like they all had the lowest price.
Well, you know what? This is where you would hopefully never see the literal same price, because we're going to use present value. So even if you have one person that is $25 and another person that happens to be $25, again, maybe there's a different level to those cash flows. Maybe one person is $25 and they go up a little, and the other person starts at $25 and they go up a bit more. I have seen procurements come down to a nickel a foot. And I as a CO, I did have to review one that literally came down to a penny a foot. But with lowest price technically acceptable, again, we have requirements, and if building A and building B, both meet those requirements, then it is going to be the lowest price as determined by present value. And once in a while, it is just, it comes down to that photo finish. But typically the spreads are just, at least 50 cents, 75 cents. We normally don't see it come down that close, but it would literally just come down to that present value calculation. And sometimes it can come down to a little bit, but we don't normally see something where we literally have the exact same present value.
Yeah, and there's fees that are included in there too. So now you start getting
Right.
very small amounts of money, or a 1% fee or something that can also tip the scales as well. The things that Charlie just said is basically what we tell the landlords. They don't get to know, or landlords, the offerors at that point, they don't get to know. This is a blind bid. So, they sometimes come to us and they're like, I feel like I'm bidding against myself. And you know what? They kind of are. They're bidding against the market and whether or not it's fair and reasonable. But we would tell a story similar to the story that, Charlie just told, which is like, I've seen someone lose by 5 cents. So, give me the price that you can justify to yourself and go to sleep at night and hang your hat on. And that's really what we're looking for. Don't give yourself any regrets that you could have gone a little bit lower.
Right. Yeah. That nickel story has probably got a lot of mileage for me. Definitely it can be very competitive. And but like Ken said, sometimes people feel like they're bidding against themselves. Well, we kind of use that to our advantage, because quite frankly, sometimes they actually are. But that's where sometimes, again, competing a lease, even if they're an incumbent landlord and maybe they're the only one that is bidding on it, just that sort of fear of missing out, can cause them to get a little bit more aggressive.
And the follow on to that one, we just had another question come in about that. So what if the new offer is the lowest, and then the current one is the next lowest? Is there a way to justify still staying in place?
Yeah,
due to cost?
When you have an incumbent, part of our price decision is going to take into account, normally we'll take into account the identified incumbent advantage. And again, that could be $1 a foot. It could be 78 cents a foot. But whatever it is, we would incorporate that when we're determining who's the actual lowest. So if the incumbent's advantage is, say, $2 or $3 a foot, it absolutely can happen and does happen that the incumbent bids $25 and somebody else bids $24. But if the incumbent advantage is $2 a foot, then the incumbent is going to win, because they're effectively going to be at, say, 23 after we take out those $2 worth of difference. So yes, we absolutely can and do justify staying in the current location. Even when we compete a lease, we do not ignore a legitimate financial advantage if one exists.
Yeah, but if you're going to do that, it definitely needs to be in your RLP that you're going to apply those type of standards.
Yes.
Otherwise, you can't just add it willy-nilly if it's not in the initial RLP.
Yeah, and it has to be defensible, and that's something where, as a client, you can help us, because a lot of times our clients do want to stay in the same place, and if the space works for you, then we want to conduct a procurement transparently. It may be that the incumbent's advantage is overwhelming and it's a sole source. It may be that the incumbent's advantage is, say $2 or $3. But that's where you can help us, especially if you have specialty build out. You can help us to make sure that we get that incumbent advantage right, because what we don't want to do is establish a $1 incumbent advantage, and then we say, well, someone else won, and you say, well, actually, the incumbent advantage should have been $6. That's kind of late. If we get a protest, that'll look a little bit like we're just trying to reverse engineer a decision. So it's important that as we go through that requirements development and that pre-solicitation, if you've got, again, holding cells and all these things that are very expensive to replicate, we definitely want to, to make sure that we get that number right.
All right, and I'm going to throw this question out. I don't think you've covered this one yet, but maybe as far as has a new lease ever been stopped after award if the agency's requirements change? Like so you awarded the lease, but then the agency requirements change. What do you do during that situation?
Has it ever happened? Again, in a portfolio as large as ours, and over all these years, yes. And what happens is we start looking very creatively at decisions. I mean, we've awarded a contract, and so at that point, it's normally not free to walk away. If you work in 1102 acquisition or general acquisition, a lot of those contracts will have a provision called termination for convenience, and those provisions are not a part of a lease contract. So normally we have a lease contract, and that lease contract might be 10 years with 5 of them guaranteed, or again, it could be all 10 of them guaranteed, or anything in between. It could be a 15 or 20-year contract. So the landlord bid on a contract, and he spent time and money bidding this contract, and he's won. And so if we have a 5-year guarantee, we're going to, first off, we'll maybe look and see, do we have anybody else that could use this space? Hey, we have space that we just awarded, and some other agency may have a need for it, or hopefully maybe all of it, or a part of it. But at the end of the day, we would have to go through some unfortunate discussions about talking to the landlord and saying, despite our best efforts, we've determined we no longer need the space, and we would have a conversation with them about what's called a buyout, and just say, okay, there's 5 years that's guaranteed. What's the value of that guarantee? We would certainly, negotiate, and especially if it was right after award, we would try to say, well, you haven't really put time and money into build out and all these other things. And so we would, again, it's a fairly involved process. It's actually managed out of our center in the Office of Leasing, and it's a fairly involved process in trying to, again, figure out what to do with that space. But it certainly does happen. We really don't want it to happen. And if we have just awarded the space, and this is a key issue here, especially for clients, you cannot terminate an OA until it has to be 1 year plus you have to give us 4 months notice. So you as the agency would have some financial obligation if you were to cancel or try to terminate that requirement immediately after we've awarded. But that's why we go through some of these checks. We have that draft OA, and we have that pre-award OA and that recommendation letter. So, you know, we try to check in with you, especially right before we sign a contract, to avoid this very kind of thing.
All right. Well, thanks, Charlie. Thanks for answering those questions. We still have some, but I think we'll get back on track with the presentation, and we'll have time to get back to these questions.
All right, cool. Well, I will soldier on here. Okay, so we are now done with the first wave of negotiations, and now we have a lease. Everything we get from this point on is locked into those pages. And, I wanted to mention this because, this is your source document for all things we give and we get from this point on, So changes at this point could and may likely come at a price, an additional price, And it's also important to note that, our memories and experiences that we have from other leases in the past from our projects and our rights in those deals, they may not apply to this deal. So have this lease document handy because it will not only guide you through any disputes or conflicts you encounter, but it also outlines the design and construction process, as well as it'll be the blueprint for managing the building from acceptance on. All right, so this slide has a handoff icon, but depending on the region and the complexity of the project, you may feel more or less of that transition. So now that we're in like the design and construction mode and less of the procurement mode, it is likely that the project manager, your construction managers and professional services people like architects and engineers will have their voices heard more often as they step forward with their roles. You'll probably hear a lot more from the landlord's reps too, not only the landlord directly, but their architects, engineers, and their space planners as well to help you with through the design and construction phases. All right. So the lease is written to help guide you and the team to move through to a finished project. So, those steps are the design intent drawings, the construction drawings, and then the TI negotiation and construction. So each of these steps are outlined in the lease for exactly what we get, who provides it, and what's covered via the various rent components. So, for this slide, the important parts of the DID are usually a general layout of the space. They capture your design elements and give enough info for those construction drawings to be created. So they're not super technical at this point, but rather like a sketch of where the walls and the doors and outlets should be. And as you go down that list, the CDs, on the other hand, they are very technical. They are the plans from which the space will be permitted. So, they have to have sufficient professional quality and detail and guidance to the trades for how to produce that finished office product. And once the CDs are finished with reviews, emphasis on reviews, the GC takes them on 2 tracks. They price them with their subs, and they permit them they get permits through the building authority in that area. And important note here, the timing of each of these elements is in the lease. So we set that baseline back in RLP lease drafting. Adjustments may be needed along the way to those timelines, but keep in point that they are contracted timelines and trade-offs might arise with changes. So, do your best work with the team to get good and reasonable timelines from the drafting of, the original document before it hits the street. All right, so this is an important FYI slide. So, and I emphasized some of these words a little earlier. So DIDs get approved, construction drawings get reviewed with comments. So this is important to note because we have a performance spec lease. We never want to break that barrier into where we potentially accept ownership of a building solution and thus the risk of its performance. So, we mandate performance. The building has to be at 72 degrees. It has to have light at this many foot candles. And the landlord needs to bring that solution to meet the spec. We have protections in the lease for when they don't meet those performance specs, but we never ever want to provide prescriptive solutions and get into the gray area of who owns that building. They own that building, and the system design and all the issues therein. This is a lease. This is not a buy. All right, so I promised this slide earlier. This is the picture and description of the GSA building shell for the most part as it's designed or described in the lease. So like I mentioned a few times before, it is a warm lit shell. And as you can kind of see here, that's an open office ceiling grid, open office HVAC system, open office lighting fixtures that meet certain foot candle requirements. And this is an important slide because as we customize that space behind that open office shell, those build out and coordination costs begin to fall on our side of the cost ledger. So, we do have some procurement methods like Charlie mentioned before, like the turnkey method, where we know build out costs before award. However, in those situations, the tenant agencies, you have to have biddable designs very early in the process, and it's not always possible or feasible for us to do that with time constraints. So, we perform this type of function more often, which is, you do the design later and fit the one building that wins. In order to do that, we do have to assume that each space is first generation in our global RLP lease, and that means we have the right for the demo to demo that lease space down to the slabs in the shell cost with no additional cost to us. That demo right enables us to always have the TIs, our changes coordinated with the shell installations. And so that way we know we never have to accept shell items already installed or pay for their replacement. We'll talk about the process of construction price determination in a few slides, but the concept of, the right of coordinated TIs with this shell is important, I think, to emphasize. All right, so we talked about various cost components, shell, op, TI, a few slides back. Every new and replacing lease in OA, we will likely have that tenant improvement allowance built in. And what that is essentially a placeholder to prepare the landlord to have money in this deal for our eventual build out of the space to our individual agency specs. And to, again, get us to apples and apples as close as possible in the procurement. There's also another cost line item, a little bit smaller than the TI in our deals, and that's the building specific amortized capital, the BSAC. And this is a separate price component that's dependent on the security level and the cost associated with those security improvements. How do we decide how much TI gets put in the deal? Well, it's based on a few factors. There's a general allowance that all agencies get, and there's tier increases based on each agency's customization needs. And finally, there's a locality index that takes into account construction costs in the various markets that we operate in. All right, so once those CDs get handed over earlier with no additional comments, we get competitive bidding back from the GCs or the subs. The lease calls for those to be in the CSI master format using a TIX table. And that helps our independent government estimators analyze whether we're getting a fair and reasonable deal on those build out costs. So, knowing quantities, material, labor costs, that enables them to do their research on the shell TI separation, along with proper prices on each of those various elements. So I will say shell TI separation can be sort of an art and a science due to that, the language that's in most, if not all of our leases about coordination with TIs. So each independent government estimator will likely have, their own process. But for us, it's a good rule of thumb that anytime you move one of those warm lit shell items, there will be a cost. So each new wall or door creates some complexity in that system. It necessitates additional materials, which comes with the labor costs that go along with those as well. So this may not come as a surprise to some of you that have been working on construction projects, but sometimes our scope of work exceeds that TI allowance in the lease. And GSA, of course, does our best to negotiate prices to be fair and reasonable, but our scopes can exceed the amount called for in the lease. So in those cases, we can de-scope, sure, or we pay via RWA for that overage. That RWA money does not get amortized in the lease like the tenant improvement allowance, and it must be obligated before we let the landlord build anything via a notice to proceed, and it's paid lump sum after the work is inspected and accepted. So speaking of inspected and accepted, what are we looking for when it's done or close to being in final finish form? Well, the lease has a call out for when the landlord should notify us when it's close. Typically, it's 2 weeks before that final substantial completion. And we begin paying on space when it is substantially complete. Substantial completion is defined on this slide. It's basically when everything left is just punch list items and the space is usable and there's no remaining items that would interfere with our use. So, we do a walkthrough, determine if it's substantially complete, and the keys are handed over. And from that point on, there is just one last important handover, hence the icon there, and that's the agency from here on out will work with the lease acquisition manager or LAM or building manager to help with any deficiencies or needed items in the space once we begin occupying. And that is the process.
All right, looks like we have a poll question here, so I'll go ahead and launch that. Have you ever participated in a construction acceptance meeting for lease space? A, yes, B, no. So we'll go ahead and close that out. I think that's an easy one to answer, just two options, and we'll see the results. Almost 50-50, 46% yes and 54% no.
All right.
We'll close those out. All right, and before we get to the Project Pulse survey, I do have some questions, Ken and Charlie. If you want to, we can go ahead and run through those.
Sure, yeah.
Yep.
We'll keep the slide as a teaser, though. Let's see. What are the main documents that should be incorporated in the lease itself? For example, should the GSA form 1217 and the agency program of requirements, the POR, be part of the final lease document? Why?
So the 1217, which is where the landlord lists a detailed breakdown of their operating expenses and their ownership costs, things like their expected taxes, their management costs, things like that, and then the operating expenses, which are those things that they use to keep the building up. That is not something that we typically include in the lease. We do include the operating cost. The 1217 is used in the procurement process. It helps us to understand if somebody bids operating costs that are $12 and we were expecting $7. That can help us to figure out, what has gone awry. But we don't incorporate that into the 1217 into the lease. We do take the bottom line operating expense number. So again, we negotiate $7 a foot. That $7 foot number will go into the lease and then is typically adjusted based on CPI, Consumer Price Index, on an annual basis. The agency's program of requirements, we generally do include in the lease. That is just, it's additional information. It was probably a part of the lease when it was put out to bid, and then it would remain a part of the lease. It certainly can have critical information that we want the landlord to have, and we want to have there in the lease to help guide them through the design process.
All right, thanks for that answer. Next question, the agency submits the requirements. If the low bid on the building comes back where it does not meet the requirements, can GSA waive that requirement?
Generally, no. Of course, there's always a way per se, but we'd have to go way back. Because so if I put a requirement out, and this is where hopefully we don't even get to that point. If we've identified a minimum requirement to be on the first floor, we hopefully will have pre-screened out a space that is not on the first floor. Or we hopefully just don't get to that point where we're even at a low bid stage. But if if somebody says, I just want to put a bid in, I don't have first floor space, but I have great space and I really want to put a bid in, nothing stops somebody from going, online and submitting a bid. And it certainly could be that somebody says, well, here's my space, and it is a little bit cheaper than the otherwise conforming space. Can we waive that requirement? The answer is really no. We would have to go all the way back to the beginning. We would have to advertise, re-advertise and redo a lot of work to undo that first floor space requirement, because maybe there's other people out there that also, had space that was not on the first floor, but they didn't bid because they read the ad and they looked at the requirement and they said, well, these people need first floor space and I don't have first floor space, so I'm not going to bid. So it wouldn't be fair to let one person in the door and then waive the requirement and let that person win. And if we did, certainly we would be subject to a protest, and a protest that we probably would lose. And so we'd have to redo the procurement anyway. But really, again, it certainly sometimes people, like I say, delineated area. We have a set delineated area. Somebody might decide to put a bid in, even if they're not in the delineated area. And again, hopefully we screen that out. But we certainly could not say, oh, well, this person is outside the delineated area, but gosh, it's a better deal. I'm just going to waive the delineated area, because again, there's untold numbers of other potential offerors that maybe would have bid, and we've now just let this person sort of come in and play by a different set of rules. So in all practicality, no.
All right, and as the tag on to that answer there, what criteria must a prospective lessor possess to be considered in the solicitation pool?
Everything that we say in the RLP and the lease, they have to meet it. So that's why we're going to go through that process of identifying your go, no-go criteria. The government, GSA, we certainly have very standard requirements that are part of our boilerplate. And that's why identifying that go, no-go requirement, getting the delineated area right, those are very important things, because changing them once we've gone out into the market, again, normally involves rework and looping back in our process, which is, additional time and effort that we'd like to avoid. So, again, it's one of these things that it's important that we get it right in those strategic requirements, because everything else we do is going to flow from that.
Yeah, I think a common conversation that GSA is going to have with all our clients is is it a requirement or is it a preference, right? And that becomes like, can you live without it? And that's kind of going to help in the early stages of those requirements development, kind of hash out some of those issues. Another time when we were talking about, the curtain closing and kind of just checking in to see how it's going. If we're not getting sufficient competition, maybe it would be a time. And back then, when, like Tara was talking about, to kind of wrap yourself in the flag of competition and be like, maybe we do need to issue an RLP amendment to the group to maybe get some more additional sources out there. And, with SECA, saying you're going to want more competition is never going to be rejected or looked at as a bad thing.
Thanks, Ken. And some of these questions, I'm trying to interweave them in your presentation as we go, and sometimes they don't always match up. But this is an interesting one. Who makes the decision on the OA, if it's cancelable or non-cancelable, and why?
Our portfolio division, we have asset managers, and the asset managers manage, among a number of things, the risk. And so we typically, we default to a cancelable OA. There are criteria to apply where, and so let's talk a little bit about what is a cancelable OA. So a cancelable OA is an occupancy agreement that after the first year, you can give us 4 months notice, and then you can give the space back to GSA. And so that's where GSA, just as us being the agency that centralizes facilities for the government, we take a certain risk, because we might have a 5-year firm term, and it could be that in year 3 of that lease, the agency decides that they don't need the space anymore. And so again, they could give us 4 months notice, and we certainly could have a little bit of term left in that firm term period where the government, GSA, cannot terminate the lease. But that's part of the risk that we manage, just as providing our services. A non-cancelable OA would be an OA where the agency cannot cancel the OA unless we can cancel the underlying contract. So in other words, if we have a 10-year firm term and you have a 10-year OA, you are going to be liable for all of the costs of those 10 years. You're not going to be able to give it back to us. You know, and so that's where who makes that determination? We have those asset managers in our portfolio management group. That subject can become a bit complex, and I've just sort of touched on a complex subject in a very high level fashion, but it is the portfolio asset manager, and they do have a criteria that they look at. Among a number of things, they look at what is our likelihood to backfill that space if you decide you don't need it anymore. You know, is it in a remote area? Is it somehow very specialized? So those are some of the things that they look at. And it is sometimes a fairly involved process in making those decisions, but they're made by our asset managers.
Let's see. As far as the prospectus and under prospectus, I think you touched on it on one of your slides, but can you tell us what the difference is between those two terms?
So a prospectus level lease is a lease where the net average annual rent is above the threshold that's been established between us and our oversight committees with Congress. So there is a certain dollar threshold where above that amount, we cannot do a lease unless we have gone through a process. It is a fairly lengthy process, and again, could be the subject of its own class one day. But it is a fairly lengthy process that involves preparing a formal submission. The submission goes to the Office of Management and Budget. After it is vetted by the Office of Management and Budget, it goes to the House and then the Senate committees, and they have to be approved. So in other words, if we go over that amount, we cannot just go out and do the lease. We have to receive permission first. And that process is, again, it takes a lot of time. It's additional work to prepare some of those submittals. And it's a lot of additional time to go through that process and get those permissions. And they're not guaranteed. You know, there is no guarantee that just because we've dotted every I and crossed every T, that we will get permission. Some of these do take on a quasi-political lean. And you know, then it can become unpredictable. We can say, well, we'd like to do this lease. And again, this is where the power of the elected officials come into play. So we can't, you know, we have a process to go through, and we cannot go and award that lease without having the right approvals. Below that prospectus threshold or non-prospectus, we have all of our necessary statutory authorities to just go out and do the lease. And you know, we do that as just a matter of our normal business.
Thanks, Charlie. And I know we have people dedicated in the regions on tracking these prospectus projects, because no one wants to have a surprise, because it takes so much time and so much documentation to get to that point. So it's definitely something I think all the regions probably track very closely. Let's see here. Trying to find, as far as past performance of the lessor, is that something that's, I guess, at what point do we track that? Do we follow up on that? Is that in the requirements checklist or process?
We go through a process of determining capability to perform, and capability to perform includes the space's ability to meet the requirements. It includes the financial capability. And then it includes making sure that they're not debarred, which would mean that entity is forbidden from receiving government contracts because of some issue. And then also part of that is that past performance check. So yes, we do have to verify, you know, that the landlord has acceptable past performance, which, if it's an expiring lease, is generally us relying on our own experience. You know, have they performed well during the prior, or have they performed, I should say, successfully in the prior lease period of performance? And you know, certainly you can have a landlord that had a few little issues, but It would have to be a rather high bar for us to say that the landlord's performance has actually been a failure. That would be something where we've had to go to certain significant concerns and corrective measures. Normally, again, we've been there for 10 years. The landlord has been performing at an acceptable level, and then we would vet them as having been approved.
And we spoke about TIs, tenant improvements. How are those? Can you elaborate on how those are calculated and determined?
Well, Ken went through that in his portion, so I'll defer that to him.
Yeah, so the leasing specialist, we have a tool called the OA tool that essentially helps create the OA. And the OA amounts, you'll fill in the information on the project you're working with. So, the agency with the AB code, the city and state, and then it'll pre-populate the TI allowance that you should have in the lease. And typically goes out like eight decimal points, and that's what you use as your for the boilerplate to put in the template. So it's a predetermined amount that we essentially get assigned through the OA tool that we use internally.
All right, and I know I'm peppering you guys for questions. So if you want me to stop, just let me know.
Nope,
very active chat pod here.
Great.
Charlie, you mentioned earlier in your slides about the CPA, the client project agreement. Is that something that's replacing the SF-81, or I've seen it where customers still submit the 81?
GSA does not require an SF-81 and really has not for decades. It is still very commonly used, and what's interesting is there actually, certainly are a lot of agencies out there that internally have their own procedural requirements to have one and to get it signed by the right person. But we do not use the SF-81 as a required document. You certainly could say that the CPA form serves a very similar function to what the SF-81 did. That would be, I think, a fair comparison. Yeah, we don't require the SF-81 and have not for some time, but they do serve a similar purpose.
Yeah, I think it's I think probably 9 out of the 10 customers I see that SF-81. So that's interesting that we haven't asked it for a decade, but I think it must be a really good form for people to use. And I know there's a lot of good information on there, so it's more of like a conversational starter.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly can be valuable, and there are some agencies that have kind of created their own versions of that 81, and that's fine too. I mean, it can be a very good way for an agency to kind of put a structure around their facility ask. But we can certainly work without the 81. If you give us an 81, that certainly can help us fill out the CPA form, but the CPA form is what we're using now.
Thanks, Charlie. And I think somebody knows your background fairly well. They asked this question. I'm sure you got a good answer for it. Can a leasing contracting officer get a lease contract with unimproved land?
Yes, we can, and almost the only time we do is for FEMA. If it is truly unimproved land, which is a fairly narrow legal definition, but if it's truly unimproved land, GSA is actually statutorily limited to 1 year. Normally, we have a 20-year leasing authority, but truly unimproved land, we can only lease for 1 year. However, there again, improved land has a very broad definition. So it certainly could be that there is an improvement on the land, or it could be that as part of our contract, the landlord is going to improve the land. And in that case, then we would lease it as improved land, and then it would be subject to our normal 20-year threshold. But if it's truly unimproved land, and there's not going to be anything that the landlord's going to do as part of the lease to improve it, we can lease it, but we're limited to 1 year.
I threw that at you, Charlie, because I know you have a lot of experience in FEMA leases, so I knew you'd have a good one for that one.
That is almost the only time. That is the only time that we do lease just raw dirt is for FEMA, because again, they certainly, I think a lot of people are perhaps familiar with the mobile home units, mobile housing units, also debris sorting. And it certainly could be for ware yard space, just to do lay down of materials. But normally there's something about the land that makes it improved. So we typically categorize it as improved land, but we once in a while, yet we do run into unimproved.
All right. Well, thanks, Charlie and Ken. I'm gonna take over this slide that we've had hanging out here. If you could put up that presentation up. There we go. The project pulse survey. So I'll go ahead and present on this one. And this one is near and dear to my heart. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to kind of horn in on Ken and Charlie's presentation. So as you see, the project pulse survey in general, the survey evaluates overall satisfaction, communication, transparency, clear point of contact, satisfaction requirements, cost and budget, schedule, and quality of work. So you might ask, well, who receives this survey? Well, this survey is sent to our customer agency point of contact, identified on either the RWA, so the reimbursable work authorization, or the occupancy agreement, the OA, for a lease project. This individual is considered the primary partner to our project management team and the best suited to share customer perceptions on the project. A recipient may forward this survey to a peer as an alternate respondent. So what does GSA do with this survey results? The project pulse survey data is aggregated and evaluated to identify trends, best practices, and areas of improvement at the regional and national levels. The survey data has helped PBS examine the root cause of common challenges and obstacles, which can then be addressed and evaluated by process change, greater collaboration, or enhanced training and outreach. Survey results are also shared with customer agencies, which allows them to review the outcomes of successful partnering efforts and highlights the areas for focused improvement. At GSA, we greatly appreciate your participation in this survey as they come in different intervals, and you'll see that on the table there for both leasing and reimbursable projects. If you have any questions, I did put a link to that survey fact sheet as well as a link to our national customer leads. And between the fact sheet and those national customer leads, we can definitely go over the project pulse survey in more detail. Hopefully, you've seen a project pulse survey before on your project. If you haven't seen it, you probably will. If you're not that agency point of contact that we send it to, you can ask. I'm sure you can ask your friends and get a little insight on what that project pulse survey looks like. But we do appreciate your feedback, and we want to make sure that our response rates are high so we can get as much information as we can, take it back to our PMs, and either if we need to course correct during the project or just keep it going if it's going good. We do appreciate your feedback on that. So we'll go to the next slide, and I'll check the chat pod, and I'll see if we have any questions. So Ken and Charlie might not be off the hook as far as questions, because we do have about 11 minutes left in the presentation. This question I do come up somewhat often. The actual lease changes on GSA's run on the web can differ from both the OA and estimates, especially in a new fiscal year. Can GSA provide timely documentation or information to agencies showing OA cost adjustments in order to align with current monthly lease costs? So they're seeing a difference between what they see on the run on the web and the OA.
Well, I would have to, in that case, it's a little bit of a punt perhaps, but that would be something that I would defer to your regional client executive, and they would work with your analyst and the portfolio division that handles that billing. that would not necessarily be something that would go through the leasing program.
Okay. How does the lowest cost technically acceptable work as it relates to TI? Does it assume the build out will cost the same at each location, assume there's no incumbent, or does it just look at the TI allowance on the offer from the lessors? It seems like each building would have a different cost of executing the build out based on what is already there or not there.
Yeah, that's a great question. We talked a little bit about this. There are some methods, or there is a method you can use to do actual building costs. That's the turnkey method, not often used, but it's something that you could do, which would consider improvements in place and the actual cost for those individual landlords to build it out. In order to help us with making things apples to apples, unless you include that, what some people call the loaded language, which is that language where you give the incumbent a potential advantage for things already in place. You are, or the lease itself is assuming first generation space in all cases. So, if you have a new lease, it's assuming that you're going to be able to go down to those to the concrete and essentially build back. Demo is part of the show, like I talked about in one of my slides. So, we do have the right to have them go all the way down and build back up. And, just the way for us to be able to do apples to apples is to do the standard TI. Now, there is one competitive portion that's part of the PV analysis that we do with negotiation objectives have targets for, and that's the tenant improvement amortization rate. Each building is going to have their own flavor about what they would like to charge us to use their money, or to have that money used over a period that we amortize back for, 5 or 10 years, or whatever the firm term payback is. We see numbers all over the board from that. Some people are very hungry for it. For a federal deal, they might give us, 0%. And then maybe other folks will, they'll, potentially realize that there is an opportunity cost for that money. And then we'll see things in, maybe the 6 to 10% range probably is a pretty common middle range for that. So, really they're competing with each other on that tenant amortization rate, that interest rate, as opposed to the dollar figure itself on most of our deals, the non-turnkey deals.
Thanks, Ken. Somebody had asked about the bullseye report, and that's something I think someone saw about on one of our slides about negotiation objectives. Is that something that we can share with agencies, or is that something that we keep internally?
Yeah, I don't think that we necessarily hand out the bullseye reports. The question is I think looking at as a delegated agency, can they use can they use bullseye? That I again would have to defer, and perhaps that's something we can address in a post Q&A. I'm not sure if the delegated agencies have access to that or not.
I will add that I believe in the bullseye is only major markets. So, if you're
Yes.
looking for anything outside the major markets, you wouldn't get bullseye anyway. So this would only be talking about those, I think, the top 100 markets in the country, or some of the MSRAs.
All right, and we did have somebody ask about the CPA, the Client Project Agreement, replacing SF81. I think we came up with the answer for that one. SF81 is not required. It's the CPA that we're
Right.
looking for.
Yeah, the CPA document has not been required. A truly required document. It is very common, but it is not a required document. The CPA is the required document.
All right. Just kind of going through these questions here. Got 5 more minutes. Should the GSA Form 1364 proposal to lease space be incorporated in the lease itself?
No, we do not incorporate the 1364. What we do is we take the information off of the 1364 and we place that into the different sections of the lease. So for example, the 1364 is where they bid the rent, their shell rent, their operating rent, so forth, so on. So the rental components will be placed into the lease in the appropriate rent tables. So we lift the information off the 1364, but we do not specifically attach the 1364 itself.
Thanks, Charlie. And I'm going through the questions here. I think both of you have crushed the Q&A chat pod. I think we answered probably 99% of the questions here. If there is one that we missed, we'll definitely record all these questions, and we'll have a formal FAQ document that we'll send out. The slides did get sent out for this presentation, so if for some reason these slides end up in your junk mail, please go to your junk mail because they are waiting for you. So, and I think our team put the email address there in the chat, so please check your email and it should be there. So before I close this out, Ken, Charlie, I'm gonna ask you if you have any final words, parting words for us.
Well, I'm glad to have this opportunity to talk to all of the customers out there, both those that are our customers and our delegated agency clients as well. Hopefully this was helpful to you, especially since roughly half of you said that you didn't have a lot of experience with this. Then hopefully you've learned a lot. In fact, we definitely are here to help you, and we can. I think we have one more poll that was loaded.
I don't think so.
All right.
Oh, there it is.
There it is.
They surprised us.
Right. Okay, so this is how you're going to be able to kind of help us. Hopefully this was educational for you. The leasing process is just exceptionally complex, and even for our people who do it all the time, it can take years to really learn, the process and the nuances. And so certainly as a client, who may not be doing this full time, again, it can sometimes be difficult to follow all of these different ins and outs. But hopefully this helped to make more sense of it. And we have this final poll here that can hopefully let us know if we did our job well. Okay. Well, good. So that is 89% that felt that it was helpful in a good way. For some of you who feel that you may still have some more training that you need, again, please feel free to reach out to us. We definitely want to help you. And there's more training coming, so take advantage of those offerings, and with time, it'll all hopefully make more sense.
Thanks, Charlie. And first of all, I want to thank Ken and Charlie for presenting with us today. And I think you've answered about 120 questions in the chat box, so I appreciate that. Also want to thank the clients for joining us. This was great. I think this might hit a record as far as attendance. We'll have to run the numbers and see if we hit one, but I think we're pretty close on that. We will post formal written responses to the questions and comments you posted in our Q&A panel as a frequently asked questions document for future reference on our website at www.gsa.gov/CES. And speaking of upcoming client enrichment series, we have a great one for you. On August 10th, we have our eRETA Digest training coming up, so take advantage of that. We are also working on more topics, and we'll post that on our website as we close out the current fiscal year and start the new one. Yes, we are getting to the end of 21. It is coming. In closing, the goal of the Client Enrichment Series is to engage our audience in workplace topics that contribute to your mission success and to your effective management of your real estate and workplace programs. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.